Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're digging into an argument that completely flips the common narrative of the war in Ukraine on its head. The source we're exploring says that to understand the explosion of 2022, you first have to find the fuse. And they argue that fuse was lit decades ago. You've heard this a million times, right? It's the story we all heard back in February 2022. And the source we're looking at today argues that this story is, well, it's convenient. It's simple, it's easy to digest, but it also intentionally ignores, decades of history leading up to that moment. And that really gets to the heart of it. Did this all just start on February 24th, 2022? I mean, if you hit rewind on the history tape, what do you see? According to the source material we're covering, the answer is a big, emphatic yes. A different picture does emerge. They say the seeds of this thing were planted way, way back. Okay, so where do we start? Well, our first stop is a whole series of really explicit warnings. And these weren't just from Russian leaders. What's maybe more surprising is that some of the loudest warnings came from very seasoned American diplomats. And we're not talking about subtle hints here. These were screaming red flags. Yeah, take this one. You might think that came from someone in Moscow, right? Nope, that's George Kennan. If you know your history, that name is a big deal. He was the guy who literally wrote the playbook for America's Cold War containment strategy. And way back in 1997, he was already calling NATO expansion a massive historic mistake, one that he predicted would absolutely provoke a bad reaction from Russia. All right, let's jump forward to 2008. Listen to how blunt this is. That's not just some opinion piece. That's a direct quote from a diplomatic cable sent straight to Washington by William Burns, the guy who was the U.S. ambassador to Russia then and is now the director of the CIA. I mean, you can't get much clearer than that. And it's not like the Americans were just reading tea leaves. A year before Burns even sent that cable, Vladimir Putin himself stood up at the Munich Security Conference and basically said it out loud to a room packed with Western leaders. The point being made here is that he wasn't being coy about it. He spelled it out for everyone. So let's put this on a timeline to see what was actually happening. You can see how NATO kept moving east. In '99, you have Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic. Then in 2004, bam, the Baltic states join, right up on Russia's border. But the real kicker, according to this analysis, is that 2008 Bucharest Declaration. That's when NATO put it in writing. Ukraine and Georgia will become members. They basically walked right over that brightest of all red lines we just talked about. All right, so if 2008 was the moment the promise was made, the source we're looking at argues that 2014 was when things got real. This is where the story shifts from warnings and red lines to, well, what the author calls direct intervention. And this leads us to a pretty central and, let's be honest, very controversial claim in this analysis. The argument is that the 2014 Maidan uprising, it wasn't this purely organic, spontaneous thing. The source alleges it was actively assisted, shaped, and even orchestrated by Washington. So where does a claim like that even come from? Well, the article points to this number, $5 billion. That's the figure that Victoria Nuland, a top U.S. diplomat at the time, openly said the U.S. had spent in Ukraine since 1991 to support its, quote, democratic aspirations. So the source is really asking a question here. Was that just innocent democracy building, or was it more of a long-term play to pull Ukraine away from Russia and into the West's corner? And then there's the infamous leaked phone call. You might have heard about this one. It's where you can hear Victoria Nuland talking with the U.S. ambassador about who should be in Ukraine's new government. And what's her take on the guy who would become prime minister? Yats is the guy. The source presents this as Exhibit A, arguing this isn't how diplomacy works, it's how an empire picks its players. To really drive this point home, the author uses a pretty stark analogy. They remind us that U.S. Senator John McCain literally stood on a stage with protesters in Kyiv, and then they ask us to flip the script. Imagine a top Russian politician showing up in, say, Ferguson during the Black Lives Matter protests. How would that have gone over in the U.S.? The source suggests we'd all be calling it what it is, foreign meddling, plain and simple. So what happened after 2014? Well, according to this analysis, it definitely wasn't a peaceful, happy transition. Instead, it was the beginning of a whole new chapter, a brutal 8-year-long war in eastern Ukraine that, frankly, a lot of the world just forgot about. And here's the crucial next step in the timeline. After the pro-Russian president was forced out in Kyiv, the Donbas region in the east of the country basically exploded into conflict. The new government in Kyiv sent in the army, and a bloody civil war kicked off between Ukrainian forces and Russian-backed separatists. And the cost of that forgotten war was just huge. Look at this number. 14,000. That's not a guess. That's the number of people the UN and other international observers say were killed in that conflict between 2014 and the end of 2021. So for 8 years before the big 2022 invasion, people were dying in trench warfare, from shelling, from sniper fire. It was already a war zone. And that right there is the core point of this section. The idea that February 2022 was the start of the war, while this author says that just erases almost a decade of bloodshed. In this view, 2022 wasn't the start of a war that came out of nowhere. It was a massive, terrifying escalation of a war that had already been going on for a long, long time. Okay, so after all that, decades of warnings, the turning point in 2014, the 8-year war. What's the big picture? In this last part, we're going to look at what the source says are the big contradictions and the major consequences of all this Western policy. The source points out something kind of strange about how we talk about Russia in the West. It's like there are two different Russias. On one hand, you hear it's a paper tiger, right? Just a gas station masquerading as a country with an economy smaller than Italy's. But then, in the very next breath, it's this existential threat that's about to roll its tanks all the way across Europe. The analysis basically asks, so, which one is it? It suggests these narratives are just switched out for whatever's convenient at the moment. And the consequences of these policies, according to this analysis, they've been pretty huge, and maybe not in the way that was intended. The argument is that it's pushed Russia and China into a tighter alliance. It's sped up the rise of a multipolar world with groups like BRICS, and it keeps this cycle going where we seem to need a manufactured adversary, a new bad guy for everyone to focus on. You know, the whole idea of this comes down to one word, really: provoked. And it's important to be clear what that means. To provoke something doesn't mean you justify what happens next. It just means you deliberately poke and poke and poke at something until you get a reaction. And that's the lens this offer is asking us to use when we look back at the last 30 years. So that's where this all lands. After laying out the decades of warnings, the direct involvement in 2014, and the 8 years of war in the Donbas, the source leaves us with one big question. Was this war really a complete surprise? An unprovoked, unpredictable act? Or was it an outcome that was actually foreseen, maybe even cultivated, and ultimately provoked? Was that fuse lit long before the explosion? That's the question we're left to think about.